7 in the morning, October 19th, 1942. A kitchen in a row house in Akron, Ohio. The temperature outside is 48 degrees, and the windows are fogged from the heat of the stove. A woman named Margaret Sowell, 34 years old, the wife of a rubber plant worker, is doing what millions of American women are doing at the same hour all across the country. She is frying bacon for her family's breakfast. When the bacon is done, she does not pour the hot grease down the drain. She pours it carefully through a small metal strainer into a wide-mouthed tin can that sits on the back of the stove. The can is about half full. It holds the accumulated bacon grease, pork drippings, and beef fat of the past 2 weeks. When it reaches 1 pound, Margaret will carry it 3 blocks to the butcher shop on the corner, where the butcher will weigh it, pay her 4 cents, and hand her 2 red ration points, good toward her next meat purchase. Margaret does not think of herself as part of the war effort when she pours the grease into the can. But she is. The can of bacon grease on the back of her stove is, according to the United States government, a strategic war material. The grease contains glycerin. The glycerin can be extracted and converted into nitroglycerin. The nitroglycerin can be made into dynamite, into smokeless powder, into the explosive filling of artillery shells and bombs. The poster in the butcher's window says it plainly. 1 pound of kitchen fat, it claims, contains enough glycerin to make nearly a pound of explosives. Margaret's bacon grease, the government is telling her, will help blow Hitler off the map. Whether that claim was true, or whether it was one of the most successful pieces of wartime propaganda the United States ever produced, is the strange and revealing story of the Fat Salvage Campaign. When people think about how America built its bombs in World War II, they think about the big things. They think about the chemical plants, the ordnance factories, the assembly lines turning out artillery shells by the million. They think about the Manhattan Project, the great secret cities, the physics. They do not think about bacon grease. They do not think about the can on the back of the stove, the strainer, the butcher's scale, the 4 cents and the 2 ration points. And yet, for 3 years, the United States government ran a massive national campaign backed by Hollywood, by Disney, by the War Advertising Council, by every newspaper and radio station in the country to convince American housewives that the grease left over from frying their breakfast was a weapon of war. The campaign was called the Fat Salvage Campaign, run by the United States Department of Agriculture and the American Fat Salvage Committee. It was one of the strangest mobilization efforts of the entire war, a program that turned the American kitchen into a tiny outpost of the munitions industry, that asked tens of millions of ordinary women to become, in their own small way, contributors to the explosive output of the arsenal of democracy. It recovered, between August 1942 and July 1945, approximately 537 million pounds of household fat. And it raises a question that is more interesting than the simple patriotic story suggests, which is whether all that bacon grease actually mattered, or whether the campaign was something else entirely, a propaganda exercise whose real product was not glycerin, but morale. To understand the campaign, you have to understand glycerin and why a nation at war suddenly needed so much of it. Glycerin, also called glycerol, is a thick, colorless, sweet-tasting liquid that occurs naturally in animal fats and vegetable oils. Chemically, every molecule of natural fat is built around a glycerin backbone with 3 fatty acid chains attached to it. When fat is processed, typically by treating it with an alkali to make soap, the glycerin is released as a byproduct. For most of industrial history, glycerin had been a relatively minor commodity used in food, in medicines, in cosmetics, in paints and textiles. It was useful, but not strategically critical. War changed that. Glycerin is the starting material for nitroglycerin, which is made by treating glycerin with a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acid. Nitroglycerin is the explosive heart of dynamite, of blasting gelatin, and of the smokeless powders, cordite and ballistite, that propelled artillery shells and bullets. Every artillery shell fired, every bomb dropped, every cartridge expended consumed propellant and explosive that traced back, in part, to glycerin. And until 1948, essentially all glycerin was made from fats by hydrolyzing the fat with an alkali to produce soap and glycerol. There was no large-scale synthetic glycerin industry yet. If you wanted glycerin, you needed fat, and a nation fighting a global war needed an enormous and growing supply of glycerin to feed its munitions plants. The problem was that America's fat supply was under severe pressure from several directions at once. Before the war, the United States had imported large quantities of fats and oils from Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, coconut oil, palm oil, and other tropical fats. When Japan conquered those regions in 1941 and 1942, the imports were cut off almost completely. At the same time, military and industrial demand for fats was soaring. Fats were needed not just for glycerin and explosives, but for soap, for synthetic rubber production, for lubricants, for paints and varnishes, for pharmaceuticals, and for the United States was also supplying fats to its allies. The Navy used lard to grease its guns. The synthetic rubber program, itself a desperate response to the loss of the Asian rubber plantations, consumed soap made from fats. The result was a genuine fat shortage. Butter, cooking oils, and fats were rationed. By Christmas of 1942, a serious shortage of butter and other fats had developed. The Office of Price Administration added butter, fats, and oils to the rationing system by March of 1943. Glycerin was restricted or removed from civilian products, from beverages, gum, antifreeze, tobacco, cosmetics, lotions, soaps, and shampoos to free up the supply for military use. Pharmacists had to learn to use other solvents in place of glycerin. The fat shortage was real, and it touched both the explosive supply and 100 other industrial and military needs. The government looked for every possible source of additional fat, and one source was hiding in plain sight in tens of millions of American kitchens, being poured down the drain every morning. In the 1940s, the American household generated and discarded an enormous quantity of cooking fat. The American family of that era ate far more meat than families do today, and they cooked it in ways that produced abundant grease. Frying, roasting, rendering. Bacon grease, pork drippings, beef fat, the skimmings from stews and gravies, all of it accumulated in the course of ordinary cooking, and most of it was simply thrown away, poured down the drain or into the garbage. One Disney propaganda film of the era claimed that 2 billion pounds of waste kitchen fat were thrown away every year in the United States. Enough, the film said, to make 10 billion rapid-fire cannon shells. That figure, 2 billion pounds, was the prize that the fat salvage campaign was after. If even a fraction of the fat that American households threw away could be captured, strained, collected, and turned over to industry, it would represent a substantial new source of glycerin and other useful fats. The waste was real. The American kitchen genuinely was pouring a valuable industrial raw material down the drain every day. The question was whether the government could change the behavior of tens of millions of households, could convince American women to save something they had always discarded, and could build the collection infrastructure to bring all that scattered grease together into a usable industrial stream. This was not a chemistry problem. It was a logistics and persuasion problem, and the government threw the full weight of its propaganda apparatus at it. The fat salvage program began in 1942 in Chicago, organized initially by a group of soap manufacturers who understood the fat and glycerin connection better than anyone. In June of 1942, it became a national program. The Conservation Division of the War Production Board, together with the country's soap and glycerin producers, turned to the War Advertising Council for help in educating the public. The campaign was placed under the United States Department of Agriculture and the American Fat Salvage Committee. The machinery of American advertising and mass communication, the most sophisticated in the world, was aimed at the American housewife. The instructions were simple and were repeated everywhere. Save your waste cooking fat. Strain it through a metal sieve to remove the food particles. Pour it into a clean, wide-mouthed can. When you have collected at least 1 pound, take it to your butcher. The butcher would pay for it around 4 cents a pound and would turn the collected fat over to rendering plants, which would process it into industrial channels. The posters produced by the Office of War Information and by commercial artists were vivid and direct. One famous poster by the artist Walter Richards from around 1943 showed the message starkly: "Housewives, save waste fats for explosives." The connection between the kitchen and the battlefield was made as explicit as possible. "The grease in your frying pan," the campaign said, "is ammunition for America's fighting men." The campaign pulled out every weapon in the propaganda arsenal, including the most beloved characters in American popular culture. Walt Disney, whose studio produced a great deal of war material for the government, made an animated film for the Fat Salvage campaign featuring Minnie Mouse and Pluto. In the film, Minnie Mouse learns that saving her excess cooking fat is a patriotic duty. The glycerin in the fat, the cartoon explains, can be manufactured into explosives. Minnie is shown saving her bacon grease in a can, doing her small part for the war effort, while Pluto provides the comic relief. The film made the same claim that the posters made, that the kitchen fat thrown away every year could produce billions of cannon shells. The use of Disney characters was a deliberate and sophisticated propaganda choice. Minnie Mouse was trusted, familiar, non-threatening, and she was a housewife, exactly the audience the campaign needed to reach. By showing Minnie saving her grease, the campaign normalized the behavior, made it seem natural and patriotic, and even charming, rather than a tedious chore imposed by a distant government. The radio campaign worked the same way. Popular radio programs of the era, including the Amos and Andy Show, ran public service announcements at the end of their broadcasts in which announcers like Harlow Wilcox would describe the conditions at the front and, in effect, guilt housewives into saving their fats. The message was relentless and came from every direction, from the movie screen, from the radio, from the newspaper, from the poster in the butcher's window. Save your fat. It is your patriotic duty. It will help win the war. Persuasion alone was not enough, and the government knew it. To increase participation, the campaign added material incentives. Starting on December 13, 1943, people who turned in their waste fat received 2 red ration points and 4 cents for each pound of grease. The red ration points were valuable because they could be used to buy more rationed meat, and meat was tightly rationed and highly desired. The 4 cents was a small cash payment, not much, but not nothing in the economy of the 1940s. The combination of patriotic appeal and material reward was designed to overcome the natural reluctance of busy households to take on an extra chore for which the benefit was abstract and distant. The incentives reflected a realistic understanding of human behavior. The government understood that pure patriotism would carry the campaign only so far, and that many households needed a concrete, immediate reason to participate. The ration points were particularly clever because they tied the fat salvage directly to something the household wanted, which was more meat. Save the grease from the meat you cook, and you earn points toward buying more meat. The circularity was elegant. But even with the incentives, the campaign faced a fundamental problem of participation, and that problem reveals the more complicated truth behind the patriotic story. Many American housewives were not convinced. The campaign met with mixed success, and surveys of the era suggest that only about half of American households actually participated. The reasons for the skepticism were varied and, in retrospect, largely justified. Americans remembered the shortages and the sacrifices of the Great Depression, which had ended only a few years earlier, and many were reluctant to return to times of scarcity and doing without. Some Americans simply distrusted the government and viewed the rationing and salvage campaigns as wartime propaganda rather than genuine necessity. A 1943 survey of women showed that rationing and food shortages had made little to no impact on the content or size of household diets, suggesting that many families were not feeling the pressure that the campaign claimed. There was also a practical resistance. Bacon grease was useful in the kitchen. It was a cooking fat in its own right, and with butter and oils rationed and scarce, the grease a family saved for its own cooking was genuinely valuable to that family. Asking a housewife to give up her bacon grease when she might want to use it to fry the next meal was asking a real sacrifice, not a trivial one. Some households donated their grease, many more kept it, used it, and ignored the campaign. The complaint also arose that lard, an edible fat that people needed for cooking, was being collected and diverted to industry at a time when cooking fats were scarce. The campaign was asking people to give up food, in effect, to make explosives, and not everyone was willing to do it. Here is the uncomfortable question at the heart of the story. Did the bacon grease actually matter? Did the 537 million pounds of household fat collected over 3 years make a meaningful contribution to America's explosive output? The honest answer, according to careful analyses, is that the contribution was relatively minor in the overall scheme of the war. The kind of explosives that could be made from glycerin gleaned from kitchen grease were a small fraction of the total American explosive production, which came overwhelmingly from industrial sources. The skeptical housewives who kept their bacon grease were, in a narrow material sense, largely correct. Their individual cans of grease were not going to win or lose the war. The numbers that the campaign cited were impressive sounding but require context. The American Fat Salvage Committee claimed that housewives needed to save 230 million pounds of used fats annually for the glycerin, oils, and fatty acids needed to wage war. The campaign claimed that 1 year's collection would provide enough glycerin to make hundreds of thousands of anti-aircraft shells. These numbers were real, but they were small relative to the total munitions output of a nation that was producing artillery shells and bombs by the hundreds of millions. The household fat was a useful supplement to the industrial fat and glycerin supply, but it was not the decisive factor in America's explosive production. The chemical industry, the rendering of industrial and slaughterhouse fats, and eventually the development of synthetic glycerin were the real foundation of the glycerin supply. The kitchen grease was, at most, a helpful margin. If the material contribution was minor, why did the government run such a massive, sustained, expensive campaign for 3 years? The answer is that the real product of the fat salvage campaign was not glycerin. It was participation. It was morale. It was the transformation of the American home front into an active, engaged, mobilized population that felt itself to be part of the war effort. The National World War II Museum has noted that the salvage campaigns, including the fat salvage, had a fundamental impact on American attitudes. By convincing broad and diverse cross-sections of American citizens that their doing without was patriotic and essential to the outcome of the war, the Salvage for Victory campaign represented one of the great propaganda victories of the United States government during the war. This was the genuine achievement. A nation fighting a global war needed its entire population to feel invested in the outcome, to feel that they were contributing, to accept the rationing and the shortages and the sacrifices as their own contribution to victory. The fat salvage campaign, along with the scrap metal drives and the rubber drives and the war bond campaigns, gave ordinary Americans a concrete, daily, repeated action they could take that connected them to the war. Every time Margaret Sowell poured her bacon grease into the can on the back of the stove, she was participating in the war. The act mattered to her and to millions like her, even if the grease itself was a minor material contribution. The campaign manufactured a sense of shared sacrifice and common purpose, and that sense was worth more to the war effort than the glycerin. The morale was the weapon, and the bacon grease was the means of building it. The final accounting of the fat salvage campaign captures both its scale and its ambiguity. Between August 1942 and July 1945, the campaign recovered approximately 537 million pounds of household fats. That is a genuinely large quantity, the product of the daily effort of tens of millions of households over 3 years. The fats were used, as in peacetime, to manufacture food, paints, textiles, and soap, and with the war's demands, also as glycerin for explosives and medicines, as soap for synthetic rubber, and for the production of paints, varnishes, and greases needed for military equipment. The collected fat went into many uses, of which explosives was only one, and not the largest. The truth of the campaign is more interesting than the simple patriotic story or the cynical debunking. The bacon grease did help build America's bombs in a small and real way as a supplementary source of glycerin among many larger sources. But the campaign's greater achievement was psychological and social. The mobilization of the home front, the creation of a participatory war culture, the transformation of the act of cooking breakfast into an act of war. The campaign was simultaneously a minor industrial program and a major propaganda triumph. Both things are true. The grease mattered a little for the explosives and a great deal for the morale. And the government, which understood this perfectly, kept the campaign running for the entire war and even beyond, calling for housewives to donate their grease even after VJ Day, when the fat shortage persisted into the post-war period. The people who actually carried out the fat salvage campaign were American women, the housewives who strained the grease and saved it in cans and carried it to the butcher, week after week for 3 years. They were not famous. They received 4 cents and 2 ration points for their pounds of fat. They did a small, repetitive, slightly unpleasant chore, day after day, because they had been told it would help win the war, and many of them believed it. And the belief was, in the way that mattered most, justified. They were part of a vast, distributed, mostly female labor force that the war mobilized on the home front. The same women who worked in the aircraft factories and the shipyards and the ordnance plants, and who also, in their kitchens, contributed their grease to the war. The American Fat Salvage Committee, in its final messaging, expressed genuine gratitude to these women. "No matter what you do," one committee statement said, "nothing can alter the fact that we and the men of the government agencies that sponsor us are and will continue to be eternally grateful to you for all that you have done to make household fat salvage a real outstanding contribution to the war effort." The gratitude was real, and it was deserved, not because the grease was decisive, but because the women who saved it had done what their country asked, faithfully, for years, as their small part in a vast collective effort. Margaret Sowell and the millions like her never knew exactly how much their grease mattered, and it did not matter that they did not know. They had done their part. The doing was the point. In a war decided by what an entire nation was willing to do, what the nation did, in part, was save its bacon grease. The act was small. The material contribution was minor. The 537 million pounds of household fat collected over 3 years was a useful supplement to America's glycerin supply, not a decisive factor in its explosive output. The skeptical housewives who kept their grease were, in the narrow accounting of chemistry, largely right. The cans on the backs of the stoves were not going to win the war by themselves. But the war was not won by chemistry alone. It was won by a nation that mobilized itself completely, that turned every household into a participant, that transformed the most ordinary domestic acts into acts of war, and that built, through campaigns like the Fat Salvage Campaign, a shared sense of sacrifice and purpose that held the home front together for the duration. The bacon grease was the means, not the end. The end was a population that believed itself to be at war, that acted on that belief every single day, and that sustained the vast industrial war effort with its collective will. Margaret Sowell pouring her grease into the can on the back of the stove in Akron, Ohio, in October of 1942 was not making a meaningful quantity of explosive. She was making something more important. She was making herself and her household and her neighborhood and her country into a nation at war. In a war fought between entire societies, the side that could turn breakfast into a weapon, that could convince 30 million households that their kitchen grease was ammunition, that could make Minnie Mouse a recruiting sergeant for the munitions industry, was a society mobilized in a way its enemies could not match. The grease helped build the bombs, a little. The campaign helped build the nation that built the bombs, a great deal. That was the real achievement, and it was worth far more than the glycerin. In a war decided by collective will, the will was the weapon, and the bacon grease was how an entire nation reminded itself every single morning that it was fighting a war and intended to win it. That was enough. It was, in the end, one of the 10,000 small things that won the war.